My name is Mel, and I've been in the system of marginalisation, medications and stigma for 20 years now. What I wish to talk about here is the connections between psychiatry and issues surrounding marginalisation and the loss of self-esteem. I want to show how many of the attitudes that are projected by society and community on people who are called mentally ill affect their health, including their mental health. I wish to explain that fundamental to alleviating the suffering of mental distress is a basic enshrinement of the worth of the individual and his or her potential in a way that accepts their pain and distress without pathologizing it, and from thence without further aggravating the sense of marginalization and disconnection that they feel. One of the really valuable things I learned during a period of abuse counseling is the right to feel what one feels. The anger, sense of betrayal and loss of years of my life were to be accepted, and the feelings I had regarding these accepted also, as real feelings. They are logical according to the experiences that generated them. That is, if one has been hurt, one has a right to be angry. This anger is a very real response to a very real action. That is, there is no reaction without action. And if one is to understand the reaction, one also has to understand the action that generated it. Through pathologizing the reaction, one devalues not only the feeling itself, but the right to hold that feeling. An inherent dysfunction is described and the reality of the feelings is doubted. If one is told that one's feelings are fantasy, the first thing one begins to doubt is one's own reality. A primary diagnostic criteria of what are known as schizophrenic illnesses. This term I use for convenience only. Actually, I can't stand the word schizophrenia because I don't know what it means. But the diagnosed individual is forced into his unreality. The individual concerned is not unreal per se. That is, the unreality is more generated through the psychiatrist's perception of the patient than being something inherent in the patient, him or herself. For example, a child may be being abused and from thence display certain behavioural difficulties, for which he might be prescribed a tablet. The prescription then exists as a pathologizing of both the child and his experience. There is something wrong with you. Through the child being denied the reality of his very real experience and being encouraged to view his experience as something that is wrong with him, he becomes divorced from his very real experiences and his consequent reality as a suffering individual, and from thence his reality as an individual in toto. It is interesting to note that many of the school shootings in places such as the United States are carried out by young people on antidepressants. It has been argued often cogently that this results from a type of psychological side effect of the medications prescribed, many of which are dangerous and toxic and not suitable for children. If you look at a packet of Lensip, they discourage its usage in children under 12. And yet medications such as Prozac and Ritalin have a far greater radical effect on both the mind and the physiology than something like Lensip. But there is also another issue. The young people who have committed these crimes have been forced into a state of marginalization. They're ill, dysfunctional, divorced from the basis of normal society, etc. Prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves. If one is told that one is inherently ill or dysfunctional, then one will behave in that manner. One is told that one can never function in society. If one therefore becomes the enemy of society, it's not through some endemic disorder, but more through being told that social inclusion will always be beyond one anyway. Just as the Palestinians have been informed that they are all terrorists, they have been treated as if they're all terrorists. And if they behave as terrorists, that's consequent to and will behave as terrorists, not through being inherently vicious. They are not. There is nothing more inevitable about a Palestinian being a terrorist than there is about an Englishman being a football hooligan. They become terrorists if they do become terrorists, because through the social and political forms in place, there is nothing more that they can be. If one has headlines in the popular press, such as Schizo knifes man on tube, as opposed to man was knifed on tube, one is the forcing of any person who has been likewise diagnosed into a state of social inclusion. He also has to keep the diagnosis secret because of the popular perception of what his diagnosis might mean. Society requires its sacrificial lambs in order to cover its own inadequacies. Most prejudice is in effect transference of dysfunction. Many of those who I've personally known in the psychiatric system, including for some years myself, have rejected any possibility of a normal functional life, not through a will to be anarchists as such, but because we perceive normal life to have rejected us. I, for myself, for some years was already on the whiskey by 9 a.m. The fact that my original problem was with alcohol made this particular pattern of behavior a particularly destructive one. I also smoked cannabis. I was not really wanting to self-destruct, but the process of self-destruction had been foisted upon me by the process of psychiatric diagnosis. These behaviors are bad for you, and particularly bad for one's mental health. But that was how I made sense of the perception I felt life had of me. I was nothing, if I was nothing, then being nothing made sense, because being nothing was at least something to be. I remember a girl called Laura who I met when living in hostels in London. She was only 16, but had been in hospital at least 12 times. Like me, she was abused. Unlike me, she was a heroin addict. She basically used heroin as an anesthetic, much in the same way as I used alcohol. But the fact of this was never explored. The heroin, as were all her other experiences, were described as part of her symptoms of schizophrenia. Actually, it was the heroin itself that was generating much of her symptoms. It would have been far easier and more appropriate to look at her addiction and help with it. But this would have required an acknowledgement of her ultimate reality, and from thence the asking of questions that her family had no wish to answer. My drinking was because I was apparently schizophrenic. That is much easier for those who might have to otherwise acknowledge my own pain and the reality of that pain for me.